I just masked things out and I rearranged things, really just distorting and warping things as I brought out the silhouette. You can see our original blocking here. So this is what we had before. And as I was masking things out, I kind of just tightened it up into this kind of formation. I just feel like the flow here with the lines is helping a lot more. And I brought down these deep background mountains. I really liked these spikes here, which is just, this background element just blown up a little more. I really like these spikes, and I didn't want to take away from them. So I brought those deep background mountains down to give this more power and form almost like a path here down the center of these spikes, as if it was a ridge that we had to get up and over. Just looking at it layout-wise, it looks like our destination is going to be going through here. So other than that, the only other thing that I did that I didn't cover in our last lesson was there are a couple times where I have a smart object that's all masked out, and I wanted to carve away more, but I didn't want to be switching back and forth between working inside of the smart object and then seeing how it worked with the other elements in here. So I just created another mask inside of this painting, right on the smart object, just to chip away and be able to react to how these other peaks and valleys are working. So let's get to bringing all these elements together and getting it into cohesive color and lighting. And where we're going to start with that is going back to our lighting reference. This was an image I found, and I really loved the lighting and colors of it. Actually, the colors are not so much. These aren't the colors that I want to use. It's a little too warm, and I want to go with a little cooler of a feel. I'm going to bring this element back in, just so we have the higher res version. And actually, I'll just convert this to a smart object so we can keep the resolution. Sometimes it takes a little bit, especially as your Photoshop document gets more and more complex and more layers in it. That's why a lot of the times I'll mask out an image in a separate PSD or open it up and mask it out there, convert it, and then bring it into this painting. But here we go. Now I'm gonna just modify this lighting reference to bring it a little closer to what my aim is. And I think it's really important to have an aim before you just start color correcting things, because if you don't know what you're going for, you can get lost in it real quick. So this is also a good chance to show some of the tools I'm going to be using for color correction. I'm not going to use that many. The most simple and basic one is hue saturation. Again, going down here to the yin yang for all of my adjustment layers. And we want to do this instead of image adjustments, levels, because we don't want to bake anything into an image. We want everything to be non-destructive and to be able to edit it later on. So hue saturation, really the only thing I use it for is bringing down the saturation or bringing it up. Rarely bringing it up. Most of the time just to bring it down. Up here you have a hue shift. So if you want to bring all the colors more across the spectrum into the greens or into the purples, you can do it here. I don't recommend that. Same thing with levels, bringing the whole image brighter or darker. Also don't recommend that. For those different things, we'll use levels adjustments. You can use curves if that's more comfortable to you. Levels is what I use. I just think better in levels because it makes sense to me. I can be precise with entering numbers or just going up and down by like 1 point. And the way you go up and down is just clicking on one of the numbers and then arrow key down or up, and that'll just move it incrementally. In levels also you have this circular arrow, and that just resets the levels. And how it works is, over here you have highlights. As you bring this down, it brings your highlights up. On the other side, you have shadows. As you bring this up, it makes your shadows darker. In the center, you have your midtones. If you bring this closer to the highlights, it'll get darker. If you bring it closer to the shadows, it'll get lighter. And then underneath that, we have here makes your highlights dimmer. Here makes your shadows brighter. So just one more time, go over it just because this needs to be your best friend. Highlights brighter, highlights dimmer, shadows darker, shadows lighter, and then midtones, darker, lighter. Then with this also, you can click up here where it says RGB, and you can make those adjustments per channel. So if I have the red channel and I bring the highlights up, it brings more red into the highlights. If I bring the shadows up, it takes away red from the shadows, which gives you cyan, the opposite of red. And then same thing down here, bring more red into the shadows, less red into the highlights, and push red in and out of the midtones. So if I want to add, rather than going over here in hue saturation and bringing it in more greens or bringing it more towards the purples, I'll do that in a levels adjustment where I'll go to red and then I'll take more cyan into it and into the midtones, and then blue and maybe add a little more yellow into it. And that way I have control over not just affecting the entire image, but control over bringing colors in and out of midtones, or if I want to bring blue into the shadows now, if I want to bring red into the highlights, I have more control this way. And I'm actually gonna cool it down by adding more blue into those midtones. And I'm gonna take out a little bit of the red in the highlights here. And I'm gonna take down the saturation just a little bit. And this is kind of, I'm liking this for the color and palette that I'm gonna go for. Maybe a little more red. But I don't want to go this purple golden. I want to still have that kind of cool tones to kind of make it feel a little more, colder. Even though we have that warm light coming in, I want the majority of this image to feel just a little cold. Bring a little cyan into those shadows. So this is a pretty good base for what we're going to try to match to. Now we just need to get the rest of the image to look like that. And the way we start with that is starting with the sky. Your sky controls where the light's coming from and what that light is doing. So you really need to get your sky down first, and then everything else kind of plays off of that. I ended up liking this sky, so I'm going to stick with it. But there's a lot of stuff we need to do to it to get it to create the lighting we want from this reference image. So I'm gonna just bring the midtones up. I'm gonna bring a little more cyan or a little less red in here. Now it has a little too much yellow, so I'm gonna go to the blue and pull the blue up. It takes some playing with and getting used to understand, where to push and pull your colors, to just become familiar with seeing, really training your eye to see the blues in your midtones or the reds in your highlights. And that just comes with practice and playing with these tools a lot. I think this is pretty close. It's a little too saturated and maybe a little more red in the shadows. So I'll add a hue saturation. A little more cyan. And that's getting us pretty close to where we want to be. I also want to have that kind of darker top of the sky and emphasize that horizon light a little more. So I'm going to create a layer. I'm going to name it soft light. And set it to soft light. I name everything, every layer, by the way, even levels, adjustments, and hue saturation. I'll just put like levels CC01, telling me that it's the first color correction on it. Because there might be times later on where I'll add a levels adjustment and all I want to do is warm up the highlights. So then I'll name it, levels, warm highlights. So it's just good practice to name everything. Anyways, soft light. What we're gonna do here is I'm just gonna grab like a color up here. I'm gonna darken it a little bit and go to a gradient and just kind of gradient that down. And I can grab a highlight color and gradient it up from the horizon. And that just emphasizes the direction of that light. We can even tone down the opacity a little bit, just using the number keys here. So now we have our sky, and everything's going to play in with that sky. And our sky matches our color reference pretty well. Now, in terms of all of these other layers, a lot of the times it can seem overwhelming when you have so much and you don't even know where to start. I like to start with the midground just so that I have a base and then color correct everything to match that base. Because the foreground, for this at least, is going to be a little darker. The background's going to be a little brighter. So that kind of gives us the middle of the color correction. So I'm going to hide all of this other than, I'll start with this midground element over here. I'll shift this over, just have that as reference so I can kind of see the colors that are happening. Add a little more contrast by bringing down the midtones and bringing up the highlights. Get rid of that red in there by bringing in a little more of that cyan. And then a little more blue in here. So overall, it's a little too saturated. I'm going to be taking down the saturation for almost everything in this painting just because I really do want to go a little more monochromatic and a little more, I don't want it to be colorful. And I'm actually going to bring down the highlights because I want this to fall into shadow, and we'll add highlights later on. But for now, we just want to set the base colors for all of the elements to kind of play into. I think that's working pretty well. So now we have this element, and it's so different from a starting point, but that's okay because we're just gonna take it one step at a time, and I'm gonna show you some other tricks to use to get colors to match as you're training your eye to see blues and yellows and reds in highlights and shadows. There's a lot of things that you can use to kind of assist you with that. So one of the things you can do is create a levels adjustment at the top of all of your layers. And I'm going to bring the highlights all the way until they start to disappear from my midground element. And now you can see the shadows of the element on the right and the element on the left are disappearing at the same time, which is great, which means that the shadows are the same value. We'll do the same thing, bringing the shadows up, and you can see the highlights disappear around the same time. It's not always going to be like this. This just happens that they're the same value. They're just different colors. And you can bring the midtones up and down to check that as well. Now, if we want to get them to the same colors, another trick that we can use is just looking at the channels. So I'll bring my channels palette over here so we can use it and the properties panel at the same time. And now if I'm just looking at the red channel here. So if I isolate the red and I bring the shadows way down, or the highlights way up, now you can kind of color correct to just get these values to match, and you don't have to worry about the subtleties of the color in here. You just can work on the black and white and getting those to kind of align. And once you get red down, we'll go to green. And then to blue. And now we can just look at both of them and take off our levels adjustment. Pretty far off, but it's just getting us there. Blue is a little too dark. It's getting us closer. So now here we can just kind of eyeball it the rest of the way. Bring some blue into our highlights. Get some red out of there. And I'm going to drop the saturation, which is going to help us a lot. Too much, actually. Now we have to tone this down. So it's a lot of back and forth, just pushing and pulling. And you want to keep some color variation in there too. You don't want to go so monochromatic that you lose all the beautiful variations that happen in an image. I'm going to throw one more hue sat right above this. And another thing is I can use this levels and I can bring up those highlights all the way and make sure that the colors of those shadows are now matching, which they are. And check out that the colors of my highlights are matching, which they're pretty close. And now I know that it's just the midtones that really need to be tweaked. And then the last thing, if you want to get at that last bit, if the colors are just so far off that that you're not going to be able to get it all the way there, I'm just going to grab a color here and just paint it right on here. And I can hit color, but you don't want to just do that because that just kills all of the color. So I'm actually going to take away this hue saturation since I'm doing this. And now with this, I'm just going to bring down the opacity. Into something like that. Last thing is these little highlights over here are really throwing it off. Look at the colors here, they're warmer in these highlights. So in order to do that, I'm going to create another layer. I'm going to first name this color, name all of them actually. Color correction 01, hue sat 01, and then I'm going to go here and I'm going to grab this kind of warm color. One of the tricks with grabbing colors too is if you hit I, which is the color picker, there's an option here that says point sample, and what that's doing is it's grabbing a color from a single pixel. I usually set this to 3 by 3 average, especially because when you get in here and you look at pixels, you don't know if you're grabbing this one or this darker shade. But a 3x3 average will just grab the 3 pixels around it and average together those colors, which will give you something a little more accurate to what you think you're picking. So anyways, I'm gonna grab this highlight color. I'll just fill this layer with it. And now I'm gonna right click here and hit blending options. And here I have this little blend if menu. And what this does is, if I pull this up, it's gonna blend this color in with everything behind it, with the underlying layers, as long as the value is brighter than this. And you can press Alt and click on this, and it drag out the other side of this little arrow, and it's feathering it. So harsh, feathered. So this is a great way if you want to add color to just the highlights. You can just pull this in. I'll show you what we're getting now. Just pull this in, get the highlights that you want, and then just feather it in a little bit. And now I can hit color on here, drop the opacity a little, and now I'm just affecting the color of those highlights to bring it something a little closer to the variations that we're getting here. So these two images are looking pretty good. Notice that we're not taking atmosphere or anything like that. We're not adding lighting right now. We're not doing anything like that. No tricks. We're just gonna get all the colors and values in the same world. Now we have this, which I'm pretty sure was taken from the same element. So what we can do here, which is really nice, is I'll just copy these adjustments over. And let's see how this works. So it's close. You know, this third element was a little brighter before, so now we can just use this as a base and now just modify it a bit to bring it into the same world. Maybe add a little bit more blue in here. Cool. Now we just go to the background. I ended up splitting this background image into two parts, just because I wanted to raise up these little spikes. So I just did an extra mask. So I masked it out like this, and then I did a second mask of those back rocks. Which is nice though, because we only have to color correct this once, and we can just use that for both. And now when we do the final painting, this is gonna wanna be kicked back into the distance with the atmosphere, but right now, we're not gonna worry about that. We just wanna bring everything into the same colors. I'm gonna eyeball it again, although we could go and use our levels adjustment at the top, which actually I'll do that just to make sure that, like you can see here, my shadows are just a little darker than everything else. So I know that I need to go in here and pull my shadows a little brighter. And this highlight is a little brighter than everything else. I'm gonna keep it a little brighter because it is a hit of light that isn't happening anywhere else. But I might tone it down, or at least make sure that these other highlights going on are in line with my other elements. So pull those highlights down a bit. And I also can see just right here that those highlights are too red and I need to inch more into the cyan. So I'm gonna go in here and inch those in. bring a little more cyan into the midtones. Now, one of the things that's going to throw us off throughout trying to color correct is we have natural atmosphere happening in these left rocks. So that's why we have this area that's a lot brighter, and that's going to throw us off trying to match this background element in. So I'm just going to go back and fix that real quick. And the way I'm going to do that is just with the soft light layer. I'm going to just grab one of the shadow colors here. Big soft brush, low opacity, and a heavier opacity over here. And hit soft light on that. Now you can see we've kind of toned that down and brought it into more what the foreground rock is doing. You can actually bring in a little brightness with that soft light as well, and warm up the brightness even. Just gonna grab a little bit of a warm tone here. Just subtly, nothing big. Just to connect it to the foreground. And especially with that area that was being affected with the atmosphere, because that is going to be a cooler tone, and so we do want to tone that down. So something like this. And I'll even name this soft light, no atmo. So I know later on when I'm going through this, what this layer is doing. Just take down the saturation back here, bring up the midtones a bit, bring down the highlights. I'm gonna actually warm up the highlights here because I'm losing a little too much of it, and then I'll just take down the warmth in the midtones. That's looking pretty good. And again, I'll just copy that. Let me name it. So it's pretty much just that process and just doing that for all of this and bringing all the color correction to the foreground and to the background and getting it all feeling like, you're not worrying about depth or lighting right now. You're just getting all of the values and all of the colors to be in the same space. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to color correct the rest of this just like what we did, just so you don't have to watch me pushing and pulling levels. And then we'll pick back up once I have them all color corrected in the same color space and go into how to create depth and add depth into this, as well as adding lighting and giving it something other than a flat monochromatic feel.